Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here. This is the Ultraviolet Podcast. And today I have the pleasure of being joined once again by John Duncan, who is a PhD researcher in human rights and neoliberalism. And today he is here to talk about human rights and how they conflict and can also cohabitate with Marxism. We start the talk by describing the modern foundation of human rights as they exist in a legal positivist framework, and how that differs from the more libertarian naturalist perspective on human rights. And then we discuss the Marxist critiques of human rights as a concept, as they sort of instantiate or require or are an insufficient instrument for combating the bourgeois liberal state, whose purpose is to maintain capital. And then we discuss, or more accurately, John discusses and I ask annoying questions, the ways in which a concept of human rights can coexist with Marxist critiques of capitalism and how they are not necessarily totally antagonistic to one another, and how we can use those ideas together to achieve a more equitable world. It was a really great conversation. I was really happy to get John back on the show, and I will not keep you from him or the convo any longer. And so I give you John Duncan. No, actually, we don't need to do that. I'm so bad at cold opens. I don't know what to do or to say. It's the most awkward shit. But yeah, you're John the Duncan, and you're here, and I'm happy about it. How you doing, man?
Yeah, not bad. That was beautiful, frankly.
Yeah, thank you.
I've got tears in my eyes.
Well, you know what puts tears in my eyes? It's human rights.
Fucking, you're such a professional.
Yeah.
The David Letterman of left-wing podcasts.
Yeah, we in one of the last shows, I think it was with Mo Black and his partner Raghava. I made a joke that I'm so bad with segues that I'm just gonna like not do them anymore, and then just put a picture of a dude on a Segway scooter up on stream.
Yeah.
Whenever I. So yeah, we're here to specifically. We have like a kind of a subject that we're going to hit on, which is human rights and Marxism, and it is a fascinating subject that I am completely ignorant of in pretty much every important way. But it is something that, from the limited amount of research I did, which was your video and some of the sources that you had there, seems to be something of a. It's a good hook, I think, to get people who are not fully versed in why Marxism and liberalism are at points incompatible with one another. Particularly liberals who back human rights very strongly, and that variant of human rights very strongly, are often not sure why Marxists are not exactly like chomping at the bit to follow them down that path. And then also for the Marxists, there is some utility in maintaining some variant of the concept of rights, which you did a video on that was very well done. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I thought maybe we'd start with you doing the heavy lifting of explaining to dummy me and the audience, who are probably much smarter than I, what bourgeois human rights are, like what liberal human rights are in the context that we're going to be discussing them.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm here. So I get like the two sort of major strands within human rights understanding, the sort of main bourgeois strands that you get are naturalist ideas of human rights or legal positivist views of human rights. And legal positivist ones tend to be the more sort of accepted, and that because naturalist arguments tend to be kind of weak. And the naturalist one basically being a human right is something that we all innately have as humans, and despite it doesn't matter about the laws, and the laws are derived from this sort of ontological level of natural humanity. And that's a difficult argument to sort of back up, because you have to fall back on some kind of like conservative, really strong liberal ideals about like what it means to be human, and what maybe God gives us these rights, and all these things rely on just like further justifying things going on and on and on higher up, and the argument gets more difficult to make, and you just sort of, it's nature, human rights for nature. And then also, what does it mean if like a right doesn't exist in law, but you have a natural right? What does that even mean? And so on and so forth. And you get like a lot of arguments among libertarians who kind of take this strong naturalist view of like a right to something without a legal framework around it. The right that they talk about. Libertarians don't like the state, and in quotes, so they fall back on naturalist assumptions about rights and the idea of rights. And the other big one would be the legal positivist view of human rights, which is essentially that rights derive from a legal political framework. In the case of human rights, this would be the UN International Legal Framework, deriving sort of from the UDHR, although the UDHR isn't a legal document. It's kind of like a declarative constitution that doesn't have any legal binding powers, but has a whole load of international legal norms and international laws which stem from that ideal. And the legal positivists essentially argue that human rights is this legal framework and nothing else. We set up this legal framework, we set up these moral standards within the law, and that is human rights. We don't have to justify it on a level really beyond that. And obviously, from Marxist perspectives, both of these have huge problems with them. The naturalist claim to the world is something that isn't particularly Marxist at all, and it's, again, rests on big liberal assumptions. And then there's things like, with positivists, what is law but an expression of dominant bourgeois systems? So they're not too happy with human rights as an expression of positivist law.
With either of those, so the libertarian view of just natural rights is something I'm actually sympathetic to, though I don't have I have a pretty strong left libertarian streak running through the back of my head, and I do find that I have, unless I'm willing to bite the bullet on, just from like a meta-ethical perspective, unless I'm willing to bite the bullet on moral realism, which I'm not prepared to do, I do find that it is difficult to substantiate that claim, and that's kind of a weird squidginess that I've found myself having difficulty with in defending, like, why I feel, well, not so much why I feel people have rights, but why my feelings about what those rights are should carry any meaningful weight in the world. Would be a better way to phrase that. And I think that tension is probably what ultimately leads to adopting a positive, like a legal positivist view. Like, would that be a fair assessment? Like, you can't repose on something unless you're willing to bite weird bullets. So you just say, well, okay, we have a state, so we'll just have the state grant rights, and that's just kind of the end of it. Was that a fair?
Yeah, I mean that's a fair way to characterize that. And there's, I think, a distinction that we can make between the naturalist view of rights and maybe one which I would be more amenable to, more sympathetic to. Is that naturalist view of rights views rights as things that do exist. Mm-hmm. This is a tangible thing which might exist, rather than, say, a softer position which might say, we use the language of rights to talk about justice issues, and it is sometimes an effective way to conceptualize a justice issue, which you don't have to do through the law, but you can say people don't deserve to go hungry, so they have a right to food, which is a different thing from the sort of that sort of liberal view of saying there is a firm and existing right to food, which exists prior to all these other reasonings about it.
Yeah, I think I'm more sympathetic to that softer view, because I'm not not a moral realist. I don't think that like the existence of those phenomenon is real in a way that exists outside of our conception of them. Now, we can say that like things are right or wrong in deference to any like axiomatic positions that we might hold, like hungry people should have food. But to say that you should have food just by virtue of this pre-existing moral phenomenon that um, that exists beyond ourselves and precedes us, like you said, I'm not as comfortable with that. But um, so I think that might be. So I would expect most liberals in the U.S. at least, like most like progressive Democrat folks, probably hold some variant of that softer position or a blending of that and the legal positivist position. But is there anything that the positive position is reposing on, or is it just the statement of we have a state, it exists, it grants these rights legally within its borders? Ipso facto, is it just that, or is there something else like underneath it as a scaffolding?
Well, it's hard to say how much is resting on the scaffolding. It will depend on who you're asking, how strongly legal positivist that person is. A lot of lawyers will simply not be able to look beyond the scaffolding. For example, a friend of mine is doing his PhD in genocide and combining it with ecocide and going beyond the legal definition of genocide as it exists within the UN Charter. And I was talking to someone else who previously worked for the International Criminal Court, a human rights lawyer, and he was explaining this his PhD to this lawyer, and the lawyer just went, "Oh, I don't agree with that. That's not the law." And then and me and my friend just sort of looked at each other like, okay, like what do you do to that? Like this is there's nothing you can do to that. But there is like the fact that a lot of the laws rest on this declarative, non-legally binding treaty called the UDHR indicates that there is at least some moral framework at work that isn't strictly legal. So there is sort of bleeding between those two positions to an extent, and it kind of depends on how strongly a person leans on one compared to the other. And there's a big problem. Like a lot of problems with the positivist approach has been in creating new laws or justifying why a new human rights law should exist. Because if rights come from the law, what justifies the law? And you have to then sort of wheedle your way back, and you end up kind of getting into this sort of faux justice sort of ground that the naturalists kind of rest on.
And I suppose my main criticism of it is it can lead to situations like we presently exist in, which is you have one governing body, or not governing body, but like one body that has a charter like the UN, which lays out a list of rights. And then you have other entities that exist either outside of or subsumed within that other body that do not acknowledge the legality of those rights. Like the U.S. is not a signatory to a number of human rights accords. I don't know them off the top of my head, but like we got we got a bad track record with assenting to any legal positivist position that is largely agreed upon by other people. So when the entirety of your position on human rights is based on that, particularly the hard legal positivist stance, you're left in a weird situation where what do you do when you have organs or entities that don't both assent to those things? Like, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah. I mean, the example of the US is a very good example of showing that the problem, the sort of fundamental problem of that legal, juridical, whatever, however you pronounce that word, political framework, where like it's clear when you look at the US how political the whole framework is. This is the superpower, and it just says, I don't care about these laws. You can't really do anything. Doesn't really matter to me. And even in cases where countries do ratify and assent to these treaties, like the UK, they frequently and flagrantly just ignore them with absolutely no real ramifications at all. So, for example, the UK has, I think, twice been found in breach of its legal duties to under the Treaty for Disabled People. It has been found breaching systemic and wide-ranging human rights abuses of disabled people, and basically nothing's happened. In fact, between the first time and ongoing, things have gotten worse. So there's a clear problem with how these structures are work and how they operate within the legal system. That you can understand why people find them frustrating.
The other thing that sort of jumps out to me, like you mentioned, the U.S. is a superpower and just says, well, we're not going to do that. Fundamentally, at bottom, and I think this might get us into like what the Marxist critiques of these things are, but at bottom, the legal positivist view strikes me as nothing more than Thrasymachus and the Republic saying, what is good is what the stronger can do to the weaker, right? It's literally might makes right. Like if you have the power to create a state and enforce your will through a legal system within that state, then you get to determine what is and is not right. And there is nothing outside of that impinges upon you to do one thing or another outside of your own will.
Yeah, I mean, there's an extent to which that is like a large extent to which that is correct, but I mean, the specifics of the human rights legal code, specifically, you can get too sort of hard on that argument, especially when you consider how human rights came to exist as a framework, and it wasn't just the superpower of the US deciding here's what we think are the moral frameworks of the world. Everyone else should abide by them. But it was actually like a really tense, ongoing negotiation between Western Bloc countries and Soviet countries. It crucially left out Africa, South American countries as well. Those have been crucially left out of so much of the human rights legal and discursive framework. But at the time, it was this negotiation between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. And that's why you have things like the right to form a union, the right to healthcare, the right to education. The whole social and economic political rights framework is a direct result of that communist engagement within the world system. Now, there's various arguments you can say how useful that's been, whether that makes any difference to the general liberal framework of international law, which are fair enough, but what it isn't is a direct and unidirectional result of Western power, which created this specific law. Yeah.
So what would I guess the UN Charter is kind of what we've been going off of, but are there, and we've been talking about like tensions, are there examples that you know of off the top of your head where one thrust or position of human rights has come into conflict with another, and what that might the tension between various conceptions of legal positivist versions of this?
100%. Like the conflict between economic and social and so-called civil and political rights, which would be like your right to political participation, your right to free speech. That's your sort of your right to vote, general civil and political stuff. The tension between that and economic and social rights has been ongoing since the beginning of human rights as a general framework in like 1948. Like you would have like the former head of Human Rights Watch until very recently. I don't know if he still holds this position, but it did in like 2013. refused to and consistently argued against the inclusion of economic and social rights as human rights, because he thought that he basically thought that they weren't human rights because they imposed duties on states to actively do something rather than refrain from doing something, and all these sort of bizarre arguments. That was an argument, a strange argument that rests between that naturalist and positivist sort of frame, because he was arguing that they shouldn't be human rights in the positivist sense because of this assumption he has about the nature of rights. And that's a very, very common argument within the human rights literature about whether or not economic and social rights should be considered human rights or not. And it's a common thing within a lot of the critique of human rights to ignore the critique of human rights from the left, to ignore economic and social rights as existing at all, because their existence can undermine the argument of those people from the left. Because, once you start saying people have a right to healthcare, a right to education, a right to housing, the implications of those arguments fully realized is essentially the overthrow of capitalism.
Yeah. I want to get to that specifically, but I want to jump back real quick to something that you said, which is the head guy with the UN. Sorry, my ADD is acting up. You said the guy that refused to change the UN charter. What was his position?
This was he was the former head of Human Rights Watch, which is an NGO.
Okay. All right. Cool. The thing you said about that weird position between the naturalist and the positivist position, where, and this is something that I think produces tension with libertarian strains of leftism, which I consider myself at least sympathetic to, and I know a lot of people who are. The idea that the state should exist specifically to defend negative rights, like to prevent the diminishment of your rights, rather than the state should be put upon to actively do things to facilitate your rights. That is a tension that I think is very important to understand, because when I think of myself as a more libertarian type, like potentially like even like a minarchist or something, I don't think of that in terms of the state should not do things. I think of it in terms of we should have an organ that does the things that are necessary for human flourishing and no more. Mm-hmm. And that is an important distinction between what I would consider libertarian strains of leftism and libertarian strains of rightism, where the right is more concerned with the absence of state action. And if the more lefty folks are, we want it to do things if it's going to exist, we can debate about whether or not it should. But if it is to exist, then it should be proactive in securing those things and then no further. And that's just I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I'm kind of spitballing.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the sort of stuff you're getting at does get to is another of the sort of major, and I think probably well-founded criticisms of human rights as a framework, which is the assumption that a state exists. And that's just an unavoidable part of the legal framework, because it's built around the assumption that states exist and states have duties to the people who live within them. So challenging that existence of the state from within, specifically this legal framework, potentially within frameworks which aren't legal, that still use human rights, but especially within the legal one, is going to be difficult, because how are you going to say the state? How are you going to say there's a right to housing? The state has a duty to provide housing while also maintaining a critique of the state as a powerful organ of capital. That's a difficult thing to argue for. And it highlights, I think, the limitations of the legal system as a means through which to achieve these things.
So that is a point of criticism of the legal positive position from I think both the more libertarian and also the more liberal perspective as well. Yes or no? Like, did I follow that
Um,
correctly?
well, the way I frame that argument, that you wouldn't really get many of the libertarians supporting it.
Okay.
I mean, because from the point of the left, like what is the state functioning as? It's an organ of capital that developed with
Mhm.
capital. So using the state as a means through the law to enact positive change isn't going to undermine capital really, because you're still
Mhm.
empowering the state. A libertarian isn't going to be that upset about the state being an organ of capital.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I think the next uh, bit of the part that we want to include is what the specific Marxist critiques of this whole framework is. And is it largely critiques of the legal positivist position, or does it also have critiques for the naturalist position as well?
so the most Marxist critiques tend to focus on the legal structures that exist and support this human rights idea. But there is the also notion that human rights as they exist are naturally individualistic, atomize people, which I don't think is a very good argument. I don't think it's particularly strong. I don't even think it makes sense within the current human rights framework. But it's one that's frequently made. Uh, even civil and political rights assume some society, some interconnection between people, not as atomized individuals, but as members of a society who work and congregate together. And there's lots of misquoting and misunderstanding of Marx on this question. Um, but the most common arguments tend to be from the left, not even just from Marxists, but from the left, tend to be about the legal system as an organ of capital, as an organ of liberal institutionalism as it emerged in the post-war era. A lot of it tied to colonialism as well. So there's lots of arguments about how colonial the human rights framework is, imposing this Western moral ideal through the legal system on global South countries without necessarily the consent of the people, which is again a fair argument to some extent, though is undermined to some extent again by a lot of people in global South countries who have used not necessarily the legal end of human rights, but more sort of a discursive and organizational framework to then challenge that liberal sort of expression of it.
Okay. Um, let's let me ask you. Well, I want to touch on the colonialism, the anti-colonialism aspect, but I think that might be a place where we can get more into how Marxism and human rights can coexist, like you mentioned in your video. So I want to go back to before we touch on that the uh, the specific critiques that Marxism has for the legal positivist case, where it, as I understand it, the critique is that and I can't remember the term that O'Connell uses in that article that you had, is the displacement theory,
Oh yeah, yeah,
where it is um, sort of, as I understood the argument, it is that legal right or human rights as they exist displace the conversation about how we should be looking at what human beings need and want, and how that power relation exists between a bourgeois state that is largely present to instantiate capital. Is that a
yeah,
fair assessment?
yeah, yeah. The displacement theory is a very specific critique. Yeah, that essentially is saying human rights get in the way of talking about capital. They get in the way of talking about these larger issues. And what O'Connell basically found, and this is the same with my research when I've done research and talked to um, organisers on the ground, and being an organiser on the ground doing the thing as well, is that it's just not really true. When people talk about human rights, they frequently talk about them in conjunction with larger critiques of capital and the way that capital works. What they don't tend to do is talk about it specifically legally. So there's a lot of, and this is really getting into my research area now. A lot of the time, when you're talking to people, the least positive they are about human rights or the human rights framework is when they're talking about it legally. They will talk about how it's incomplete and it's not what we need. So like we talk about human rights to an extent, but it's not enough. Which itself is an argument against the displacement theory, because they're acknowledging that it's not enough and we need to do more. But also they will talk about human rights beyond that legal context, and they will say we need to assure we have a right to housing outside of the legal framework. We need to ensure that we take housing back from property developers, that we take it back from private hands and distribute it collectively. And they talk about this stuff in conjunction with rights. So the idea that the displacement hypothesis idea is not one that has really much empirical support, basically.
Okay, well, fair enough. Talk more about, and I think this is something that you mentioned in your video as well, is the Marxist critique that human rights function as a way to effectively legitimize the system of capital. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument that as long as capital's fine, as long as you have these rights systems, you have this basic floor on standard of life, then capital is fine, and you don't have to worry about it. I don't know if that argument makes particular sense with the human rights system, because in no time ever has the human rights system fully lived up to what it says it should do.
Yes.
Because again, like we said earlier, to fully live up to what it says it would do would require, at the very least, a restructuring of what capitalism is, or else a complete deconstruction of capital and capitalism. So I'm not sure how strong the argument that you get a lot of regimes like America, who talks about spreading human rights as a moral crusade, and they use this sort of discursive language to justify their imperialism. But that is the same with anything. You talk about any sort of moral level, and the West will use it to do imperialism. You might talk about it's common within LGBT rights, or feminism gets mobilized quite a lot to justify imperialism and spreading values and shit. So I don't know if that argument itself is necessarily a good one against the general concept of human rights, but it is one that people use.
So what would you say then is the strongest Marxist critique of the system of human rights, like in its most robust form? And then from there, we can talk about why that might not necessarily be fully adequate.
So I mean, my most sympathetic, and the argument that's basically correct, is the Marxist argument against the whole legal regime as one that can adequately. You could adequately pursue justice through. You could adequately transform the system through. And it's a very clear and easy argument to follow. These systems exist for the benefit of capital. They emerge from liberal regimes. They have these assumptions about the state. They're colonial as hell. Even at the state level, pursuing things legally can have very limited results. Who has the money to take a human rights claim to the Supreme Court in either country? Not very many people. Big organizations maybe, and already once you're a big organization with money, you have proximity to the institutions, and your ability to transform those institutions is already limited by that proximity. So there are very, very, very clear arguments against the human rights system as it exists through the law and through institutions, and it's basically correct.
And then your position then is that is not fully adequate, that we should, that not just necessarily that we should, but that where you encounter people on the ground making those arguments and working to achieve their necessities and working against these systems, that they actually do incorporate the concept of human rights into what they're doing, so that critique isn't necessarily complete? Would that, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, my position is basically that that is a very good argument against human rights in one of their dominant, perhaps the dominant expression of human rights, but that is not the entirety of what human rights are or have become. And it's certainly not how we see people use human rights in all contexts. Like you said, like people will often use the moral claim to the right to access healthcare or education to then build social movements off of. And a big thing for me is something I've noticed is that in the areas of so-called social reproduction, rights claims are really clearly easy to use and galvanize mass public support, which can then be transformed into larger social movements. Big examples of that being the Right to Water campaign in Ireland, right to housing campaigns that I've been part of, groups like Focus E15 tied up the right to housing alongside big anti-capitalist, explicitly anti-capitalist rhetoric and movement building. Across the world, indigenous groups have used the right to land to form their own sort of human rights ideas, and have specifically rejected the idea of institutionalizing those rights within a legal framework because they recognize the problems of that. And it's basically like you said. There's a quote from, I guess, Barker, where he says, "You've got to meet people where they are, use the tools that they have generated themselves and build with them." And people have generated specific tools of human rights discourse and human rights organizing strategies, which shouldn't be approached from a Marxist and going, this is wrong. This is liberal, the way you're doing things. Because that's a bizarre way to interact with a movement which might use human rights as a organizing paradigm. Instead, you meet them where they're at, and then you build from that.
Do you find that when there are groups on the ground who are actively using human rights as a focal point of their, or at least a facet of their organizing, particularly with the folks you talked about who don't conceptualize them as a positivist position within a state framework, how are they thinking about human rights in those terms? Like, do they have a framework, or like what framework are they using to conceptualize it and advance it? Like, how does that function outside of that?
It's essentially, so they essentially just use it as a claim to justice, a claim to we should have, like the right to land, the Via Campesina International Agrarian Movement, who used right to land, basically them just saying this land, which has been taken from us by international corporations funded by Western states, this is our land as a community, and we have the right to take that land. We have the right to access that land. We are demanding that land back. They don't say we're going to make a challenge to this group through the UN's, this new UN charter we're building. They say we are going to organize action and demand that we have this land back because it is ours, and as a community, it is ours. Which is again a point against that notion that human rights are innately individualistic, because a lot of the time these are conceptualized as community rights. This is the right to our land as a people.
That's interesting. Does that claim repose on anything that wouldn't reduce to a more naturalist position, or is there something like grounding it that is different than that?
So what I would conceptualize that would be a more social constructivist view.
Okay.
Whereby the notion, which is sort of like we were talking about earlier, where the notion of a right is built upon a claim to justice, and then sort of build around it. It's not necessarily saying this is something that exists ontologically prior. It's like this has been taken from us, and we need to find a way to build a way to take it back. And so we use this rights language to make this justice claim and to demand it back. And that's the sort of the social constructivist way, which So, some Marxists don't like the idea of social constructivism because they think it's too woolly or too like where's the construction coming from? Where's the emergent point?
I was actually about to jump on that. I just to be the devil's advocate here. From whence comes a claim to justice without a pre-existing concept of a just system of rights?
Oh, I can't answer it. From where comes your system? From where does your system of justice come? Yeah. From a wider range. I mean, particularly with Indigenous people, there are a great number of many and varied systems of justice which have taken the concept of rights and built upon them. So in that, it's social constructivist in the sense that they've taken a concept and built on it with different concepts that have emerged in different places. That isn't necessarily saying in the liberal sense, all men are created equal under God. Here are their rights. It's more like here's something that is being told we have rights, and here's something that we as a community have built together, and here's how we've meshed them together in this particular context.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's, and I don't really, so what I had in my head there was, fundamentally, like if you're coming from that position where we're going to like have a social constructivist view where we have, okay, here's a concept of rights, here's, the things that we have as a community, and we're going to merge those together, and we're going to impose that on the world around us or attempt to do so. The immediate response to that, particularly, I would expect from like a liberal mindset, is, well, where is your justification for doing that? And I think it's to demand well, how do you have the right to do this? And that is, I imagine, coming from a perspective where you consider the legal positivist position to be a sort of just ontological given, like it's just like legal positivist realism. You don't even consider the fact that the reason that you are reposing on a system that at one point was put into being by people saying this is the system now. There's really no fundamental, particularly if you get rid of the naturalist position, the legal positivist position versus the social constructivist position, both effectively are reposing on people saying, well, this is just what we want to do. And there's neither has a firmer basis than the other. It's just that the legal positivist one has won the popularity contest via imperialism.
Yeah, I mean, like that's going to be the result of any kind of argument which rests on morality, isn't it? You're going to end up going back to that. So in the end, you kind of just have to choose what you think is a more just system, whether or not it's imperialism or anti-imperialism.
Which I have no problem with, but I think that does make that particular bit there probably is what makes a lot of liberals uncomfortable. And I would, if you are of the liberal mindset and you're listening to this, which I hope that you are, that's why I'm having this conversation so you can hear it, is I would encourage you to reflect on the fact that there is fundamentally no difference there in the justification system that you repose on and somebody else's. It's just that yours was existing in the world when you were born and you took it as a given.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of my take on it. Is it's pretty much all like I'm pretty fuzzy on the whole like our moral. I'm not a moral realist. I think it's pretty much all vibes all the way down, and like it's whatever core axioms you come to agree upon or think about for yourself, and then just building up from there. And at the end of the day, I will have a strong position. Like we can have an argument about whose axioms are better, and that argument can get so contentious that we send armies to kill each other over them. And I don't have a problem with that because I just like mine better than yours enough to do that. And I think that makes people uncomfortable too. But that really is the position that we're in, just ethically, is we have competing systems of axiomatic values. One of them is that the liberal state is a net good and should be taken for granted, and the others are that it's not and shouldn't, and neither is objectively more correct. It's just evaluating them independently, or like judging between them.
I mean, I'm not a moral philosopher, and certainly not. Well, certainly not a philosopher of I don't really care much about the sort of moral philosophy of human rights and all that stuff. I tend to be quite pragmatic about them and what they do, which is, I think that sometimes that from certain Marxist circles and critiques of human rights, they kind of smuggle in a kind of moral argument about the innate badness of human rights on a kind of moral level because of their dominant expression within the legal system, which can lead to very fast dismissal of groups which may use human rights, or people who even use rights language in particular contexts. But I'm not really concerned necessarily about how moral your argument about human rights is, or where you get your fucking moral axioms when you're resisting imperialism. I'm just more interested in how are you resisting imperialism, or how you're existing in the context I look at in my PhD. How are you resisting neoliberalism and austerity? Are you using human rights? How and why? And these are the sort of questions that interest me more than anyone else. And the fact that social movements do use them and have used them successfully is, in my view, enough evidence for Marxists to not be outright dismissal of it on a sort of just straight up axiomatic level.
What would you say is a really good, like the best example to your mind of a group who has deployed human rights language or the concept of them to resist imperialism or neoliberalism? Like if you were to sell a Marxist on it, like by example.
I mean, for on imperialism, the groups like Via Campesina are really good examples, and the indigenous and peasant peoples movement, who specifically organised around that right to land. Against neoliberalism, the right to water movement in Ireland was particularly good. They generated the biggest social movement since the Irish Wars of Independence, which was explicitly anti-austerity and in a large part explicitly anti-capitalist. And they didn't necessarily overturn capitalism in the same way that Via Campesina hasn't necessarily overturned imperialism, but if that's the standard that we're judging social movements on, there's never been a good one. But they've been very successful to some degree in generating these big social movements, which have, the Right to Water campaign resisted the privatisation of Ireland's water supply, which is a big thing to do.
Yeah.
Via Campesina has had many victories in many contexts against increasing encroachment into peasant land. They've resisted to some degrees there. So these are really good examples, I think, of strong human rights-based movements that have had broad anti-capitalist power.
Yeah, the right to water, particularly as we approach, a future more and more Mad Maxian as time goes on. The right to water thing strikes me very clearly as a situation in which, if you are going to use human rights language if you assert, like you said kind of at the beginning of the conversation, if you assert that human beings have a right to water, it follows naturally from there that you have to, in some way, if not constrain very tightly, seriously examine some of the fundamental assumptions of capitalism and private ownership of resources. Like, you can't have the CEO of Nestle saying that all water should be privatized and a concept of human right, or of water as a right. Those are incommensurable with one another.
And do the people of Flint have water? Like, there's clear examples, and this, I think, gets back to what I was talking about earlier. That that realm of social reproduction, which is the realm in which labour power is recreated, whether that's through education, housing, access to food, healthcare, these areas which are sort of base reproduction of humans and reproduction of human labour power. These tend to be the most the areas in which human rights tend to be most active. And I think it's because, to some degree, it's those sort of more base needs like water and food and shelter. These are extremely base things that people need. And so it's easy to say, what is the point of a right if I don't have access to water? What's the point of anything if I don't have access to housing and food?
Yeah. I've done a lot of work in my own head trying to elevator pitch my politics. And it strikes me now that using human rights language as a vector for pushing what I believe might actually be effective, because what I've gotten it down to is I think that every human being, by virtue of being a human being, deserves access to free and equal access to all the things necessary for life, sustenance, and meaningful participation in their society, which would be food, water, housing, education, transportation, communication.
Mm-hmm.
And that those things should be granted to every person everywhere just by the fact of their mere existence, and that we should have the smallest administrative system or state necessary to facilitate that. And it strikes me that assuming those things to be human rights does impinge upon that system to facilitate them, rather than trying to make an appeal to something like a legal framework of, well, there's no basis in the law for you to have a right to this, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm. And also, the problem with the law, say you've got a right to water. The lawyers are not the best people.
Yeah.
And they can go, well, so I get an example in Ukraine, even before the invasion, most water had to be, you can't drink tap water. It has to be filtered through another thing, whether that's an expensive pump or buying a filter. And what that is a block between someone and their ability to access water. If you're poor, you can't afford a pump. How do you get water? You're just going to have to risk contaminated water. For some people, that might say, "Oh, this is a very clear violation of your right to water." For a lawyer, they could say, "Well, there is an ability for a person to get water by some means. Therefore, the right to water is not being impinged upon." And similar ways you get that in lots of US situations where you can buy water from the shop, therefore the right to water isn't being infringed upon. And this is, again, the other big problem with the pursuing it through the law. You make this challenge that via a legal structure, and you'll get Satans in suits, fucking lawyers making these sort of arguments. But if you're just like, nah, fuck you, this doesn't count, I don't care about your law, like, fuck off, it's a much clearer sort of case.
Yeah. Particularly, like, very often, like you said, the the letter of the law very often can be interpreted as you have a right to water within the law, which means, well, you can buy it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like it particularly in neoliberal context of, like, or neoliberal as well, but a right to a thing very often just means you do not have anything preventing you from spending money on that thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't actually translate into a guarantor of your possession of it.
Yeah, and that's one of the big arguments from the left, that human rights are necessarily, you get a lot of arguments for human rights are necessarily neoliberal in particular, and that's one of the big arguments in favour of that position. But like we've gone over, that's not necessarily the entirety of the discourse or the means in which people approach rights. And one of the big things that you hear quite a lot from people is that they view this, like you were talking about earlier, the right to access healthcare and education and stuff. They view that not as an end point, but as a starting point of an argument. So talking to someone who works in education, he'd say a lot of the time, the education union he works for says you have a right to education, and we use that as the ground starting point. And from that, we build up what is education, what's education mean, how is the way that education is structured under capitalist society really inhibiting a full education, a full realization of education, a completely transformative view of education. So the right is like a really basic level of getting people hooked and getting people organized, and then it's not like a intellectual grounding for how to build or how to critique the system of capitalism. Because very few advocates on the left or people who use human rights will say, will criticize capitalism on the ground of it infringing on human rights necessarily, on like an intellectual. Like I would never say capitalism is bad because the rights are necessarily being infringed. You'd say here are the processes at work in capitalism that produce certain conditions, which in the end destroy your ability to access water or education. But the fundamental processes at work are still what's being criticized.
Yeah, when I conceptualize rights, like just in my own head, like particularly in reference to like my elevator pitch, what I always imagine is, like you said, it is a baseline of this is just what you get by virtue of being human, and we build up from there. It's not you have permission to potentially maybe access this. And I always think about this in terms of, like I was a paramedic, like a street medic for quite a while, and one of the largest populations who use ambulance services is homeless people, because they don't have any other means of getting medical care. At least in the U.S., where it's a fucking dystopia in terms of our healthcare. If you don't have insurance and you don't have access to a primary care physician and you don't have housing, the most effective way to get your medical condition dealt with is to just call 911. An ambulance. And so I would frequently encounter people who were housing insecure, food insecure, had very limited access to resources to improve those conditions via education, employment, or other things. And when I think about human rights, what I think about is you have the right to not find yourself in that position. Fundamentally, we live in a society where there are houses, where there's food, where there is medical care, where there is education, where all these things exist. And some number of people don't have them because of made up reasons that don't matter at the end of the day if they lead to a situation where all of these people don't have those things. So I think you have the right to not be in that state of those people that I so frequently encountered who were discarded by the system because they were no longer able to produce.
Yeah, I mean that's a consistent. That's a fair way of conceptualizing it, and it's consistent with how a lot of people I've spoken to in movements on the ground conceptualize it. This is stuff that we should be able to expect by virtue of being alive, stuff that we need to live, and so we need to demand it. And this is the way that those demands start.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and that might actually be a call to power to end it on. I think we'll go out on a high note there and just say if you agree that people should have the things that they need to live, then maybe go out and investigate how to make that happen in your local area. And do you know any? You've mentioned a few groups, and I'll put them in the show notes, but is there any place that you would recommend somebody who is new to this idea and concept to convert their interest into actual activism, where you would point them?
So I guess depending on where you are, not just not just labour unions is good, but I mean, labour unions tend not to use the human rights stuff, I've found, but always useful to join a union. A renters union is something I think is going to be increasingly important as time goes on. I'm a member of two of them, London Renters Union and another one that I've been doing work that Focus E15 group for a bit. Just depending on where you are, there'll be local community groups that you can always go to who always need some support and doing what you can, because we're busy. Life is hard right now. Cost of living crisis, COVID. Stay safe. What you can is all you can do.
Yeah, that's something I've said frequently is do what you can when you can, and if everybody did that, we would probably be in a better spot overall. Like you're not obligated to break your spine against the shore of capitalism. You're just obligated to put the shopping cart back in the trolley case and go on about your day, right? And whatever that presents itself as, if it's helping somebody near you or doing some work that you can do in your free time to help other people, then just do that. And find out. Renters unions are a good spot. I'm sure most people in most metropolitan areas have access to those, and that would be a good radicalizing place for people. Food Not Bombs is one that I would throw out there for food insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that just if what we've said appeals to you, then please consider going out and trying to make the world a slightly better place. John the Duncan. I'm going to put a segue up on screen. Do you want to plug your pluggables and tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. I'm everywhere at John the Duncan on YouTube, Twitter, fucking TikTok these days.
I forgot you have a TikTok. I'm not subscribed to you on there.
I barely use it. I went on there because I thought it'd be a good way to promote. It's where all the young folks are. I thought it'd be a good way to promote a video. And I got a video that TikTok got close to 1 million views, and I gained 2 subscribers. And I thought, it's not worth it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, John the Duncan, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. It's been a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards again, and I just wanted to thank you for watching or listening, however you're getting this particular bit of content. I want to thank you for getting it. If you like what I do here, you can support me financially on Patreon, Venmo, Coffee, PayPal, all those things at UltravioletPod. It's really appreciated and really helps me do this and make this a hopefully one day at least break even labor of love, if not outright profitable. I'll take break even. So if you can help support the show, I'd really appreciate it. And offset some of that overhead with hosting and the website and all that stuff. And I would also encourage you to please go out and support my guest's Patreon. John is currently working on his PhD. And any little bit of income that he gets really helps him continue to do that. And I think he will be a continued asset for the left in terms of this particular discourse. So get in on the ground floor and help the man out. If you are unable to support me financially, I totally get it. No big deal, but you can still help the show. Like and subscribe to me on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, just wherever you get the show. Hit the alert button so you always know when a new one comes out, because the algorithm doesn't like me because long form, very wordy, lots of swear words, etc. So that really helps. Leave a comment, leave a 5-star review. Anything that helps boost me in the algorithm helps, so I would appreciate it. You can follow me on Twitter at UltravioletPod. I'm also on Twitch at UVPod, though very infrequently. So yeah, thanks once again for watching. I really, truly appreciate it. And I will see you on the next one.